Well, thank you very much indeed for that generous introduction, and thank you too for this invitation to speak, be the first speaker at this conference. And please don't blame me for bringing you in out of the sunshine. I want, just before I begin, to speak about this, an invitation to speak on this, I think, rather difficult subject has both advantages and disadvantages. I want to thank my former pupil, Michael Rips, who's here in the audience, and my former colleague at the National Gallery in London, David Bomford, both of whom were kind enough to look through my remarks and significantly improved them. So, a personal view of this subject, which I hope will give us something to talk about. It will introduce the topic to you, such introduction as you need, and will also, I hope, pick up some of the points which we can then develop in greater depth during the discussion later today. I joined the National Gallery in London in November 1971, at the tender age of 23 as the Curator of Dutch and Flemish 17th century painting. And I have the need to explain to this particular audience that that was a time at which promise was valued above achievement in the young. A couple of years later, the National Gallery was offered Rembrandt's portrait of Burghardt, a painting which, as you all know, is today in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. At the time of which I'm speaking, the portrait was in the collection of the Earls of Rosebery and hung in their great house, Mentmore Towers. The then Earl of Rosebery had taken the decision to sell the house and its contents, a spectacular sale which was handled by Sotheby's and took place in 1977. Under the terms of enlightened UK legislation, it was and is possible to pay outstanding tax by giving a work of art to a public museum. The value of the work, once it's been mutually agreed, is subtracted from your tax bill, or as with a recent case at the Ashmolean, if the value exceeds your tax liability, the museum pays the difference in cash. So Lord Rosebery wished to pay the tax due on his father's estate and the highly successful sale by presenting this Rembrandt to the nation. It was brought to the National Gallery and examined in the conservation studio. I was hugely impressed by this painting, which I hadn't seen before, although there can be no doubt that it had been very heavily relined in the 19th century, and much of the impasto, notably in the face and the hands, had been flattened. However, I saw no reason to doubt the traditional judgment, which was that this was the portrait of Burghardt by Rembrandt, which is mentioned in the sitter's own diary of the 13th of April, 1633. He records there that he sat to Rembrandt and that the painting was commissioned by an admirer and friend, Abraham Antonissen. However, mine was very much a junior opinion. The then head of conservation at the National Gallery, Arthur Lucas, declared that the painting was a copy, principally because of the lack of impasto in the hands, particularly in the hands. And the then director, Michael Levy, agreed, as did, it must be said, Neil McLaren, by then at Sotheby's, but previously for many, many years, Curator of Dutch and Flemish and Spanish paintings at the National Gallery and author of the first edition of the Catalogue of Dutch Paintings at the National Gallery, which we all admire very much to this day. So, the painting was sent back to the Roseberys as a copy of a missing original. Lord Rosebery kept it in his estate and paid the inheritance tax on it as a copy at a valuation of £5,000. which meant that when he came to sell it some years later, in 1992, no inheritance tax was payable on the painting. It was sold by Sotheby's, catalogued in full as by Rembrandt, and bought by Otto Naumann and Alfred Beda. The painting was then restored with great sensitivity by Nancy Krieg in New York, taken off the old, stiff, too-taut lining. The impasto, which had been pressed down by the pressure applied to it, corrected itself to a significant degree. Then it was cleaned, a very simple process which simply required the removal of a discolored varnish, essentially, very few retouchings on the picture, and was subsequently sold at, it must be said, a very substantial profit to the Rijksmuseum just 6 months after the Sotheby's sale. And it now hangs as one of Rembrandt's most important early portraits at the center of a breathtaking group of early paintings by Rembrandt. It's catalogued in volume 6 of the Rembrandt Research Project as Rembrandt and Workshop, with the proviso that the hands are executed by an unnamed member of the studio. Let's just concentrate. Incidentally, this is slightly off my topic, just off the thread of my talk. Incidentally, this seems to me to be an extraordinary proviso. The prominent positions of the hands, the fact that Altenburghardt was famous for his declamatory preaching, made it surely most unlikely that Rembrandt would ask another artist to paint the hands. Surely the argument should, in fact, be stated the other way round. That is, common sense dictates that the hands are by Rembrandt, and so this is how Rembrandt paints hands. Shades, of course, of Morelli here, how he paints hands in 1633. But I anticipate my argument back to the National Gallery and its child curator. How was this extraordinary mistake made by the National Gallery? A mistake which denied the gallery's public such an outstanding work. There is, after all, contemporary evidence that Rembrandt painted a portrait of Altenburghardt, and the painting had a very impressive provenance. What told against the painting was undoubtedly its condition, and above all the thinness of the paint layer and the apparent lack of impasto. This appeared to be confirmed by the X-rays, which showed the painting to be thinly painted with no significant pentimenti. Also, I think, in thinking about how this decision was made, I think the fact that this picture, the famous portrait of an 83-year-old woman who may be Aake Klaus-dochter, in the National Gallery, which is painted on panel and signed and dated 1634, it was brought up, I remember well, from the Rembrandt room to the conservation studio to be studied alongside the Altenburghardt. And there's no doubt that it made the latter, in its pre-restored state, look dry, formal, and in terms of the paint surface, very, very flat by comparison. So, what did happen? Once a doubt is raised, especially when it's raised by somebody as influential as Lucas, it is hard to ignore. In decisions by committee, as it was effectively, of this type, there is undoubtedly a sort of herd instinct. Also, it is, of course, very much easier to say no rather than yes. I've seen that many, many times in my career. What happened was a failure of connoisseurship and a failure to understand the true condition of the painting. It has haunted me ever since, because although I believed in the painting, it's clear that two very, very visually sophisticated museum curators, Michael Levy and Neil McLaren, both of whom I admired enormously, and a very experienced conservator, got it entirely wrong. I begin with a story of the failure of connoisseurship, and yet I would not, of course, have accepted the invitation to speak today if I were not a passionate believer in the significance and value of connoisseurship. The basis of connoisseurship is, of course, a profound knowledge based on long study of the work of a particular artist. This is the connoisseurship of John Smith, Willem van Bode, Abraham Bredius, Cornelis Hoffstede de Groot, Wilhelm Valentina, Max Friedländer, and Horst Gerson. Clearly, the best connoisseurs, such as these, have a highly developed visual memory. This is a phenomenon which, as I'm sure we will find in the next 2 days, is extremely difficult to describe. An innate sense of style, of composition, of handling, of color, the balance of light and shade, and so on, resulting in an instinctual recognition of a particular hand. So less a Morellian concern with apparently insignificant detail, and more about interlinked approaches to composition, to color, and yes, to style. But don't think me naive, I am all too aware of the subjectivity of such judgments. Naturally, the development of such a visual memory must be based on seeing as many authentic works as possible, and is founded, in the philosophical sense, on the principle of induction. That is, predicting future events from past experience. But, of course, as you know, philosophers also speak of the problem of induction, in which there are always exceptions you cannot predict. Let me take an example. Rembrandt again. This time, the smaller portrait of Margarethe de Geer in the National Gallery. When the technical analysis was done, it was found to have a ground which had never been observed before in the artist's work. And so, together with apparently being a reduced version of another portrait of her, you remember, also in the National Gallery, doubts were raised. Subsequently, examples of that ground have been found in paintings that are certainly authentic. So in this particular case, the sample was simply not sufficiently large to take account of this information, this data. The parameters were too tightly drawn, or perhaps the wrong parameters were drawn altogether. In addition to their remarkable visual memories, most of my connoisseurs had a very healthy respect for the archival evidence. If the painting was said to be by Rembrandt in contemporary or near-contemporary documents, if the provenance was impressive, that is, if the history of the painting could be traced back a long way, ideally to a moment shortly after its creation, then the likelihood, they believed, was that it is what it claims to be. While skepticism is always valuable, excessive skepticism can mislead. Let me give you 2 examples. There is, as you all may know, a group of 6 etched copies by Jan van Vliet after prototypes by Rembrandt. We know, of course, that Van Vliet worked closely with Rembrandt in the early years, and these prints all bear the inscription RHL Inventor. Nothing you might imagine could be closer to solid historical evidence. And yet, the Rembrandt Research Project, in their first incarnation, rejected the paintings from which the prints were evidently made. They've been reinstated in Volume 6, and indeed Van der Wetering uses this group as an example of where the project went astray by essentially drawing their parameters too tightly. A second example is the self-portrait of Rembrandt, which today hangs in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, said on very good authority to have been purchased by Robert Carr, Earl of Ancram in the Netherlands during Rembrandt's lifetime and presented by him to Charles I. Could there be a more impeccable provenance? And yet the painting has been rejected by the Rembrandt Research Project. Of the 8 renowned connoisseurs whom I've listed, the only one I knew was Horst Gerson, who was very, very kind and generous to me as a young curator, and whose memory I revere. I hope I can just be allowed one personal anecdote. I spent the summer of 1976 in The Hague for my first extended stay at the Rijksbureau. And Gerson had come to The Hague from Germany almost 50 years earlier as an assistant to Hofstede de Groot. He told me that he remembered how lonely he had been, how bleak those evenings in The Hague were, until he became a member of De Witte, the club then and now on the plain. He therefore kindly made me a member too, which, it being summer, also allowed you the privilege of using the pavilion at Scheveningen, of which I took great advantage. That act of kindness was entirely characteristic of the man. In 1968, Gerson published his own complete catalogue of Rembrandt's paintings in a volume which also included a long essay on the development of the artist's style. This essay, which I esteem very highly, is rarely referred to, I think, these days. The volume in which it appeared was huge, lavish, and expensive, and that has counted against the availability of Gerson's essay, which I commend to you. Gerson's catalogue is based, of course, on Bredius's catalogue, the first edition of which was published in 1935, but it was not until the following year, until 1969, let's say the year after his monograph appeared, the 300th anniversary of Rembrandt's birth, that Gerson's third edition of Bredius was published by the Phaidon Press. With undue reverence, I think, for the first two editions, it was published in black and white with poor, milky illustrations. The catalogue was a reworking, essentially, of that of the previous year. It is, in my view, though, a remarkable achievement, a triumph of the thoughtful connoisseur. It created a great sensation at the time as Gerson radically reduced Bredius's number of accepted works. It's full of important insights based almost exclusively on the profound study of the artist over many decades in the Rijksbureau, of course, of which Gerson was director, and elsewhere. Gerson had a clear idea of just what Rembrandt was capable of. Rembrandt also, no doubt, was. But Gerson had a clear idea of just what Rembrandt was capable of and what he was not capable of at every moment of his career, although he wouldn't have expressed it like that. He was a very modest man. It's surely this mental picture of what a Rembrandt of 1630, of 1640, of 1650, of 1660 should look like that is the very basis of connoisseurship. Judged by the admittedly very high standard of Agatha Bass of 1640, is it conceivable that another painting was by Rembrandt and dates from in or around that moment in his career? Surely building this mental picture is connoisseurship in its purest form. There was an interesting example of this process a few years ago concerning the Anna and Tobit in the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam, apparently signed and dated 1659. In this case, Ernst van der Wetering and Jeroen Giltij crossed swords about the attribution of the painting. Van der Wetering for and Giltij against, and their disagreement provided the basis for an intriguing small exhibition. Incidentally, there are I recommend to you, two very entertaining YouTube videos. One by Van der Wetering entitled Rembrandt ? Yes, it has to be him! And one by Giltij entitled Rembrandt ? No, I don't recognize him! You will enjoy those. Van der Wetering has also returned to the subject in what must be the longest single entry on an individual painting in Volume 6. Giltij had looked at conventional elements, handling, depiction of facial features, and so on, and concluded that they were too crude for Rembrandt. In a letter to Van de Wetering, which is quoted in Volume 6, Geltij writes, "The figures are arranged rather awkwardly in the picture space. The background is poorly defined, and the right-hand side of the painting simply wilts to an end. Parts of the work are fairly amateurish, such as the unstructured figure of Anna, the exceptionally weak hand, and the limp brushstrokes trailing over the floor." I think this letter probably sounded rather better in Dutch. But anyway, Van de Wetering, at least in the exhibition, argued from an entirely different point of view, saying that Rembrandt's handling and degree of precision were constantly changing, and that since those parameters were always shifting, they were therefore entirely unreliable. Instead, he argued, you must look at elements that never change, such as the rendering of light and shade, the color contrasts, abbreviation of forms, disposition of figures in the composition, and so on. If you consider those apparently immutable parameters, the Anna and Tobit can be argued to be by Rembrandt. In Volume 6, Van de Wetering expands his argument considerably, bringing technical evidence to bear. He argues that many of Geltij's arguments for excluding the painting from Rembrandt's oeuvre are, and I quote, trivial, and that art historians who consider themselves connoisseurs and other experts tend to base their opinions on their personal intuitive judgments rather than on evidence. And here I think we come to the crux of our discussion. He continues, the objection repeatedly put forward as an argument by Geltij, "I don't see it," is a typical example. What is apparently meant by this is that the painting does not correspond to Geltij's fixed idea of Rembrandt's style. This fails to recognize that Rembrandt's paintings from this period can differ so essentially in scale and appearance that it is impossible to maintain the image of a uniform style. Such intuitive connoisseurship, as evidenced by Geltij, turns out to be a most unreliable instrument when applied to this artist in this particular phase of his activities as a painter. Actually, it seems to me, Van de Wetering, despite his claims of the unreliability of intuitive connoisseurship, and Jeroen Geltij are in fact both practicing connoisseurship, but by adopting different parameters, they end up with different conclusions. And if, by the way, it is of any interest, my own view of this particular painting is that it is indeed by Rembrandt. At this point, it's worth remembering that Bode described his own method as scientific, though, of course, he was using science in a broader sense than we would do today. You remember that Hofstede de Groot encountered difficulties in 1923 when he authenticated a Frans Hals forgery which had passed through the auction house of Frederick Muller. It seems to have been Van Meegeren's earliest forgery. When chemical analysis showed later pigments in the picture, Hofstede de Groot wrote an essay, Echt of Onecht, Oog of Chemie, very nice, in which he defended his judgment by saying that the problem was with later restoration and that he, as an experienced connoisseur, was not wrong, or perhaps could not be wrong, is really what he said. To underline this point, and I rather like this element in the story, to underline his point, he purchased the picture for his own collection. Bredius, as we all know, published Van Meegeren's Sapere Timaeus as a premiere in the November 1937 issue of the Burlington magazine. Subsequently, the great conservator, Paul Koremans, saw Van Meegeren paint Christ in the temple after the war, so Bredius must, interestingly, have known the truth before his death in March 1946. However, to return to Horst Gerson in 1969, he did, of course, have some technical help. He and I looked at X-rays and also some infrared photographs in the National Gallery Conservation Studios together. In his catalogue, he does sometimes refer to X-ray images, in particular Rembrandt's heavy application of lead white in the underpainting, but the connoisseurship of X-rays a hard-to-learn skill in its own right, was not something he was drawn to. I was, however, remarkably privileged to work closely with the talented conservators and scientists in the National Gallery Conservation and Scientific departments. I owe a very particular debt of gratitude to Joyce Plesters, who taught me how to read X-rays and paint samples. She, I hope you all know, was very much in the vanguard of the taking of paint samples and the identification and sequencing of paint layers. It's evidently the availability of technical information which differentiates the modern connoisseur from earlier generations. To this audience, I surely don't need to describe them: X-ray photography, infrared photography and reflectography, dendrochronology, thread counts, neutron activation, auto-radiography. Crucially, the information supplied by all these means needs, and I think this is important, needs to be read and studied as profoundly as the appearance of the painting's surface. All these techniques have their pitfalls. It's very easy to be mislaid by X-rays, for example. Knowing how to discount the stretcher bars is just the very first step, and these, of course, can now be removed by computer manipulation. But I'm constantly being shown X-rays and told that there are significant changes to the underlying design on the very slightest of evidence. Only last week, I was shown pearls, what was meant to be a pearl necklace, on an X-ray of a portrait of Henrietta Maria attributed to Van Dyck, which actually corresponded to surface damage and subsequent retouching. Conservators themselves are not immune, if I may say, to the misinterpretation of technical evidence. The famous dispute between my dear and much-missed friend Walter Liedtke and the Metropolitan's head of conservation, Hubert von Sonnenberg, which led to two contradictory catalogues for the Rembrandt, not Rembrandt show at the Metropolitan in 1995, was based on two ways of looking both at the paintings and at the technical photographs and material analyses. Von Sonnenberg, in my view, leapt to conclusions based on technical images which suited his predetermined prejudices and presuppositions, an entirely circular method of argument. Reading his catalogue reminded me of my encounter with the elderly restorer Helmut Roman. Roman was still working at the National Gallery in the days when I went there. Roman was the author of that sacred text, The Cleaning of Paintings. He had the two Tripp portraits in his studio in those very, very early days, paintings which, like the Altenburghardt, have suffered, actually far more seriously, from heavy-handed relining in the past. He was substantially repainting, you should know, the Jakob Tripp. Here it is. And when, in my naivety, I asked him how he knew what to repaint, he simply replied that after a lifetime of work on paintings by Rembrandt, he knew what to do. He hinted at an almost mystical relationship with the artist. The promise of technology to solve the problems that old-fashioned and highly subjective connoisseurship could not solve was the key element and the distinctive element in the foundation of the Rembrandt Research Project. Project also rejected very much, embraced very much the notion of a team of scholars, which would, of course, replace one person's opinion with those of a group, and also an interesting issue to which we may return. The project grew, however, as is well known, out of a simple exercise of connoisseurship. Bob Haak, at that time an assistant at the Rijksmuseum, was present when the crates containing the paintings from museums and private collections around the world were opened for the great Rembrandt exhibition at the Rijksmuseum in 1956. He developed the strong conviction, simply by comparing them stylistically, that they were by a number of different hands. And interestingly, of course, it was Jan Wet in 1898 when he visited the 1898 Rembrandt exhibition at the Stedelijk, came to exactly the same conclusion. In the event, it took until the late 60s to get the project underway, and it should, in my view, have been led by Bob Haak a remarkable, a redoubtable connoisseur whom I knew well and admired very much. But Bob did not apparently have the requisite number of degrees for such an academic undertaking, and Joost Brown, a distinguished medievalist, whose thesis and whose profound interest was in Van Eyck, was chosen to head it, and that was a mistake, I think, that haunted the project for much of its existence, as Van der Wetering's remarkable essay on the history of the project in Volume 6 makes very clear. There can be no doubt that the original impulse of the project was anti-connoisseurship and anti-individual connoisseurship in particular. The subjectivity of connoisseurship was criticized, and the ostensible objectivity of technical information admired. Science will solve all the problems of who painted what and when, was the starting point. Certainly it can, and it certainly has solved some. And yet, as Gary Schwartz has pointed out more than once, in the first 3 volumes of the project, there is precious little discussion or reliance on documentary evidence, iconographic argument, or really detailed scientific investigation. There is, as we all know, a profound difference between the approach laid out in Volume 1 of the project and that described in Volume 6. There is also, in Volume 6, Ernst van der Wetering's remarkable essay. Those of you who haven't read it, I do very much commend it to you, in which, with very few holds barred, he outlines the history of the project. And it is a story, though he doesn't quite see it like that, it is a story effectively of a return to traditional connoisseurship, a story in which technology gives way to connoisseurship, and yet there is also, underlying that, a profound yearning for objectivity. As I've already said, there was a belief in 1968, when the project really got underway, that scientific investigations would solve those problems. In this context, it's very important to remember that the Rembrandt Research Project's first port of call was the National Gallery in London, because the Rembrandts there had been examined more thoroughly from a technical point of view than any other group. X-rays, some of which were partial, and notoriously, that's why I put this as a kind of mea culpa, putting this picture up, notoriously in the case of Frederick Riehel on horseback, the partial X-ray had missed the underlying standing portrait, which we now know about, and was an extraordinary miss, as it were. Infrared photographs, some paint sampling have been done, and that work was to culminate in an exhibition, Art in the Making, Rembrandt, in 1988, with its catalogue, in which I and David Bomford, as conservator, and a scientist, Ashok Roy, collaborated on the study and description of the Rembrandts in the National Gallery collection. And so began, with that first visit to London, the creation of the great mass of technical material by the project, which is today in the Rijksbureau under the skillful curatorship of Michiel Franke. This is an immense resource for the study of the artist, but let me emphasize once again, it must be used, of course, with care and real understanding. Returning to my list of technical approaches, we still rely, of course, on X-rays, pigment and cross-sectional analysis for the most part. The difference between now and 1968 or 1988 is simply that we have so much more experience at looking at them and a far greater, though still, of course, incomplete, sample. Infrared is not very much used today. It's not very useful for these paintings. Dendrochronology is valuable, but it must always be remembered cannot be used for very precise dating, despite assertions to the contrary. Thread counts are also valuable, but of course they take you only as far as the studio. Both masters and pupils use the same roll of canvas, we imagine, or indeed to the shop selling artist materials. Neutron activation autoradiography, which alarmingly made paintings radioactive for a few weeks, has largely been abandoned, but in its place is the relatively new technique of scanning X-ray fluorescence, which maps elements and hence pigments across the entire picture surface and through the thickness of the paint. This is, I think, an enormously valuable addition to conventional X-ray analysis, and is coming up with a lot of important new information, but these, of course, are still relatively early days for the technique, and, of course, we simply, as yet, don't have sufficient data to draw really decisions, conclusions from them. Such technical information can help the connoisseur immensely. In the first place, it should be able to detect later copies and imitations. We're also building up a mass of information, of course, about the sequence of Rembrandt's application of paint at various stages of his career. Presently, this still has to be handled with care, as we have yet to assemble enough material. The samples are not yet numerous enough to be definitive in order to come to real conclusions. Does Rembrandt use his characteristic double ground invariably, or just at particular historical moments, or often but not always? If it's the latter, then the usefulness of this information in matters of attribution, that is, in creating the parameters within which to work, is, of course, limited. The creation of a very rich archive of Rembrandt technical material at the Rijksbureau is perhaps the single most important legacy of the Rembrandt research project. Volumes 1 and 2 in particular revealed an undue dependence on technical analysis, but combined with this, and probably arising from it, was also a failure of connoisseurship, especially when dealing with the mass of portraits painted by Rembrandt during the early Amsterdam years. As it's now been recognized, was a far too rigid a definition of what was by Rembrandt himself. The great case in point was that of the so-called Beresteyn portraits at the Metropolitan, on whose behalf Walter Liedtke took up the cudgels, and I too played a supporting role. It's now accepted that the definition used by the project at that moment was too exclusive. Rembrandt, in those early Amsterdam years, was simply working very hard to establish himself as the city's leading portraitist, and there is undoubtedly a range of quality in his work at that moment. There can be no harsher example than the portrait of Philips Lucas in the National Gallery, which hangs very close to the 83-year-old woman, the former very, very routine, the latter quite outstanding, but both definitively by the artist himself. The Pelicorn portraits in the Wallace collection are another case. For me, the slightly ungainly compositions, no doubt specified by the patron, and the technique revealed them to be by Rembrandt with minimal studio assistance. Two paintings which I saw hanging in Harold Samuel's house in Haywards Heath many years ago, and on the acquisition of which I congratulated him warmly, were The Old Man of circa 1630 and the self-portrait in a feathered cap. The former is today in the Getty, and the latter at Buckland Abbey, a National Trust property in Dorset, to which it was bequeathed by Lady Samuel as by a follower of Rembrandt. Samuel's collection was formed by the brilliant dealer Edward Spielman, but Samuel was unnerved by the rejection of the Rembrandt research project of The Old Man and asked Spielman to take it back, which he did, and then sold it to the Getty. The self-portrait Samuel excluded from his great gift of his collection to the Mansion House in London because it had been downgraded by the project. Both paintings were a great loss to the Samuel collection at Mansion House. And it is, if I'm allowed an aside, it is ironic that if you visit Buckland Abbey today, as I did 3 weeks ago, you are invited to watch a video of Ernst van der Wetering describing his rediscovery of this painting, which only, of course, required to be rediscovered because the project of which he was a member had dismissed it. Since the retirement of Brown and his colleagues and the consequent leading of the project by Ernst van der Wetering, there has been a striking move towards the primacy of connoisseurship, an acceptance that while technical information can take you so far, much inevitably depends on the eye of the connoisseur. This was very apparent in a number of exhibitions which marked the 400th anniversary of Rembrandt's birth in 2006, in which a substantial number of paintings were reintroduced into the discussion of Rembrandt's work, which had been removed, some of them by Gerson, in 1968. These included a number of so-called oil sketches, which had previously been thought to be partial copies after Rembrandt. In my Burlington Magazine roundup of these exhibitions, published in the February issue in 2007, I questioned this new group, and Van der Wetering responded in the same journal some time later. I don't have the time, or indeed the wish, to revisit these arguments. You should read the articles and make up your own minds, but suffice it to say that in this case, these oil sketches, the argument turns on whether or not, in the different ways in which we conceive the painter's working practice, he makes frequent use of oil sketches painted in oil or paper on panel. Once again, the prime concern is with the mental image of the artist and his way of working, built up by the study of his painting over many years. Rereading Van der Wetering's essay on the project in Volume 6 recently, I was much struck by his remarkable honesty in outlining his difficulties with the approach of the project, and in particular that of Joost Bruin. He's very insistent that what misled the project was a too rigid understanding of Rembrandt's stylistic development, as well as a failure to give sufficient attention to documentary evidence, such as the etchings by Van Vliet, and to technical evidence, notably dendrochronology. The new position he sees as moving the subjective nature of connoisseurship in the direction of the objective, as he perceives it, nature of scientific investigation. A creditable hope, certainly, but one which, as we've seen, is fraught with problems. It's to my mind a great shame that the corpus Rubenianum has not, at least in principle, followed the lead of the Rembrandt Research Project and included full discussions of attribution, workshop participation, state of preservation, and technical analysis. There is, of course, much of the very greatest value in these volumes, despite the striking differences in quality and indeed in emphasis in the various volumes, particularly, of course, the iconographic research and a developing sense of Rubens' stylistic changes. But the decision to avoid issues of authenticity and instead to rely on Burckhardt's judgments was an error made long ago, and understandably, when the intention was to publish Burckhardt's catalogue in relatively short order, but one which, in my view, should have been corrected subsequently. As we're all aware, the functioning of Rubens' workshop, to an even greater extent than Rembrandt's, is the key issue in understanding the totality of his production, and while this is touched upon at many points in the various volumes, it's not, it seems to me, grappled with in a clear and cogent manner. There is, however, a catalogue raisonné which I use almost every day, to which I would like to pay tribute. This is the volume devoted to Van Dyck's paintings, which appeared in 2004. Published by Yale, it's Van Dyck's Paintings, a Complete Catalogue. There are 4 authors who worked together and visited collections together. I'm just finishing, I promise. When I get to Van Dyck, I'm towards the end. There are 4 authors who worked together and visited collections together, but are solely responsible for the catalogue entries for the 4 periods of Van Dyck's career: the first Antwerp, Italy, second Antwerp, and England. There is a relative consistency of approach, which is very different, for example, from the Rubens corpus. Where possible, technical evidence is used and referred to, but in the case of Van Dyck, the majority of paintings are not in major museums, but in private collections, public buildings, and small museums which don't have access to sophisticated technical equipment. The entries are not as extensive as the project, but for the great cruxes of Van Dyck scholarship, the several series of early apostles, for example, there is extended treatment and impressive analysis of previous opinions, as well as no reluctance to make judgments. Perhaps the single most impressive section is that devoted to Van Dyck's English period, when his studio was in full flow, and there are very real differences in quality of his work. In my view, this is very instructive and to some extent applicable to the work of other artists, because it's absolutely clear that when Van Dyck was painting for Bernini, for Cardinal Barberini and other connoisseurs in Rome, in, for example, this painting, the great triple portrait of Charles I, and the Wrightsman Henrietta Maria, he takes infinite care and uses all his skill. For Van Dyck, Rome was the home of art, and he longed to impress. When he was painting for the English gentry, however, his attitude was very different. Suffolk was not the home of art, and the quality of his art falls off accordingly. The author of this section of the Van Dyck catalogue was Oliver Miller, an outstanding connoisseur of the generation following Gerson. Oliver was steeped in the culture of 17th century England, widely read in the literature of the period, and also a great investigator of archives. As many of you will know, his edition of Abraham van der Doort's great inventory of the Royal Collection is an absolute model of accurate transcription and publication. His knowledge of Van Dyck's work in British collections was built up over many years and completely unrivaled. Evidence of this can be found in his many notebooks, which were bequeathed to the Paul Mellon Centre in London. Here, in Oliver's precise, elegant, and yet almost entirely illegible handwriting, are accounts of his visits to English houses and his detailed notes on individual paintings. Here is the core of his remarkable connoisseurship. It involved patient, systematic looking over many years, combined with deep archival scholarship. Add to that the use of the rich technical resources which are now available, and it's to that practice and those high standards that it sets that those of us who believe in connoisseurship aspire. Thank you.